Hi, welcome once again to another episode of GM Musings. This week we talk about world building, and we will probably have at least 3, maybe 4 or 5 episodes on world building. In this one, we focus on the core elements of world building, and we will talk about 2 different techniques to create a world, to start creating a world as such. The most important thing when creating a fantasy world is to create a world that is believable and real enough so that people can form emotional attachment to this world, an emotional connection with it. And that sort of thing is important because if there is no emotional connection between your players and the world you have created, and between yourself and the world you have created, then the game will not be very interesting. After all, who wants to save a world if no one cares about said world? That won't be very satisfactory for your players. On the other hand, the world should not be too real. Role-playing games are in some way, shape or form always a bit of an escapism. Because we are not quite super content with our own world, we are trying to travel in our minds to different worlds, which is what role-playing games do for us, or books or movies for that matter. So if you make a game world that is too believable, too real, too close to our own, that might put people off as well. So a world, as I said, it has to be real enough so people can form an emotional attachment with it, but at the same time, it has to be fantastic enough to capture imagination. It has to also to be understandable enough so your players can understand what's going on and they don't struggle too much to fill in the details, to draw conclusions from the events that are going on. But there should always remain also some sort of mystery. This is a fantastic world after all, and players, no matter how long they explore the world for, they should always have some parts that they have not seen yet, or some secrets that they have not unveiled yet. The 2 main things when creating a world that you have to think about is sources of conflict, and conflicts in general, and the motivations for those that are within those conflicts, heroes and villains, so to speak. So basically we are speaking about who wants things and why do they want them, which is the motivation, and also why cannot they have those things that they want. Maybe there's 2 parties after the same thing and only one of those parties can have them. There's a conflict right there. Or maybe there's 2 parties that have opposing goals. They're not after the same thing, they're after different things, but the 2 things that they're after cancel each other out. There's a conflict there as well. There is 2 basic approaches to world building. They're called the inside-out approach and the outside-in approach. They both have their strengths and weaknesses, and we'll talk about them right now. We'll start with the inside-out approach. What that means is you start small and start moving towards the bigger picture. Basically, you start with a local setting. Maybe your setting is a single town and a few villages around and the landscape around those settlements. Or you can go in even smaller. You can go just one single village, a little bit of forest, maybe an old ruin, a lake, a few fields, and that's your whole setting for now. Or even smaller, maybe your setting is just a farm where 2 families live and they have problems that the player characters will have to help them with. Once you have flushed out that center in the inside-out approach, your one village, your one city and a few villages or whatnot, you slowly move outwards. You move from a village to the neighboring town, then to another few villages, then to the province, then to the realm, and so on and so on and so on, however far you want to go. The main benefit of the inside-out approach is that it takes far less time than the outside-in approach, and it is more focused on relevant parts of the story. Because you are creating something that's geographically very, very close, that's very centered around the geographic location, chances are very high that you will not create much content that will not be used in the game. Because if everything's close geographically and everything's sort of connected in quest lines, then your player characters are very likely to visit all those places and follow all those quest lines if they can, which means that all the content you have created is used, which means you have not wasted, so to speak, any time on creating content that will not be used in the game after all. However, be careful that you do not go into too much detail. Some people with the inside-out approach like to be bogged down in creating every single NPC and every single building in a village, which is not necessary, and really most of the time can be a waste of time, and it can even be a wall, a box, so to speak, for the game master's imagination. If you create too many details, they might box you in, and you might struggle to interpret player character actions that do not quite fit into what you have expected, or improvise story hooks that you might need to improvise, because there is no space in this setting of yours for such things. How you start with the inside-out approach is you create the major players first. Maybe there is a mayor of the town, maybe there is a bandit lord outside, and maybe there is some sort of monster. Those three are the major players. The next thing you do is you create conflicts between those major players, and also between maybe some minor players that are flashed out as you talk about and think about these conflicts. The bandit lord and the mayor, they might both want the monster dead, but they also might want both each other dead. Maybe the mayor and the bandit lord have some personal rivalry, or maybe they're working together in some ways. So there's different types of conflicts that you can create, and from the larger scale conflicts, many smaller scale conflicts can happen, can be created. Maybe a member of the city guard has been fighting on the orders of the mayor, the bandit king, or the bandit lord, and that soldier's brother has been slain by the bandits. Now that soldier is also has a very personal vendetta against the bandit. That's another conflict being created here. Or maybe for some reason the monster starts protecting the city, and now the bandit lord has an even more of a obligation, even more of a will to kill that monster, whereas the mayor starts thinking about maybe not destroying it, maybe sparing it for now, shifting the conflicts around. And then after you have the major players, after you have the conflicts, you go on to create culture and geography of this inside-out approach, this little sandbox that you have created. Now, there's a bit of a danger with the inside-out approach, because you're creating only those things that are close to the player characters, basically, and slowly fleshing out the rest, moving outward. If your player characters ask things like, "Oh, I wonder what the name of the king is and what he's like," or "What's the name of the neighboring kingdom and what's their relationship with our kingdom?" These are questions that players might come up with, and educated NPCs would be reasonably expected to have those answers. So it can be dangerous if you don't flesh out the rest of the world, or at least the immediate surrounding area, at least to some detail. You don't have to go into very deeply into detail, but just have some basic ideas ready in case that your players ask those questions. Inside Out, in the end, is reactive world building, which means that you create the area when your player characters start going there or arrive there. That can be good in some ways because, as I said, you will not be wasting work because most of it will be used, and also it allows you to react on the player character's actions, and if maybe they even give you ideas and you're like, oh, this elven player character has been talking about some ruined castle that he might want to visit, or maybe he has one in his backstory. So okay, I'll put that that ruined castle just over there on the outskirts of the province, in that haunted wood that I have not created yet, but I will so now. The bad part about reactive world building is sometimes you don't have the time. Maybe your players all of a sudden get the idea of, let's travel east and see what's there. And you have to come up with maybe a village and a swamp on the fly, which isn't always that easy. Now, the outside-in approach is the exact opposite, basically. It starts with the big, massive picture. You can go as far outward as you want. Maybe you create a continent and 500 years of history for that continent, ever since some sort of cataclysm that wiped out all the old kingdoms. Or you can go even further. Maybe you start with the first civilization that blossomed 10,000 years ago, and create 5 or 6 continents. Or you can go even further out. Maybe you go all the way to the creation of the world, or even the birth of the gods, even further out, or whatnot. I mean, there's really nearly no border that you can reach. It's that just the question is, how far out do you want to start? Now, as you might have realized, that approach can take a lot of time if you have to worry about a lot of history, a lot of realms, a lot of different gods, and so on and so on. And also, a lot of that content might end up unused. If you create 5 kingdoms on this continent, chances are that your player characters will only ever visit 3 of them. So what you have created in the other 2 kingdoms might end up unused and so to speak, a waste of time. I mean, I personally would not consider it a waste of time because every exercise in world building, everything you do can be reused later on, and it makes you a better world builder. But people who have a more limited amount of time have to be more careful with where they spend it. Also, if you focus on the big issues, the wars between the gods, the evil powers that have been growing for millennia, you might tend to miss a lot of the small issues, the local ones. And your player characters, especially if they are lower level, they will most likely run much more often into these small local issues than they will into the massive big ones, which means that for them and for your game in a lot of ways, the small issues are more important, funnily enough. Luckily, you can combine both approaches, the inside-out and the outside-in approach, and basically zoom in from the outside-in approach whenever you wish. You can start with the history of the world, with the birth of the gods, create a pantheon and 2,000 years of history until the first kingdom was created, and then you say, okay, we'll jump to the present, and now I'm creating a village and a little bit of surrounding area where the player characters will start their campaign, and then you can jump back and forth between inside-out and outside-in, and that's probably, to be fair, the best way to approach world building. Now, your main thing that you should strive for while building a world is to build a powder keg with bombs or rods of dynamite just waiting to go off, and then wait for the spark. Ideally, the spark will be the one provided by your player characters with their actions. Characters must be able to change the world, to change the order of the setting, the current order, so to speak. The world should appear static at first, especially towards the start of the game, because your player characters, or your players, are only slowly starting to get to know your world. So don't change things too drastically at the start. If you create a town structure with several NPCs who are the leaders of the said town, and your player characters have just met those leaders and have just started to understand how they influence each other and what their relationships are, don't have someone come in and kill all of them and then force the player characters and the players to get to know in a completely different group of rulers. For instance, that will feel quite stressful and maybe a little frustrating to your player characters. Wait with these big changes until the player characters are a little more settled, and give them the chance to change the world. Only give them the chance. They have to do it themselves. Speaking of changing the world and speaking of history, what you're creating as the game master is basically a photograph of history, a moment frozen in time, the present, so to speak, the present affairs. Now, a lot of people start, especially if they're following the outside-in approach, way back in history, and then they start creating these 3,000 or 4,000 years of history of the rise and fall of kingdoms, NPCs that have conquered and then been conquered themselves. And that is a trap you can fall into quite easily. History is good. The creation of history is helpful, but it is only important if it is relevant to the present. For instance, If there was a conflict between an order of paladins and an order of necromancers 500 years ago, and the paladins wiped out the necromancers, that detail is only important if it has some relevance to the current time, to the present of your game. So maybe the necromancers, some of them have survived, gone into hiding, and are now returning after 500 years. Maybe the paladins have risen to power after this conflict and are now controlling the whole realm. In that case, the history is very interesting. If both the paladins and the necromancers are gone forever, then their whole war with each other has no bearing on the present and will not be relevant and does not need to be mentioned or created. Looking at conflicts, please try to do something else than the old ultimate good against ultimate evil. It is not very believable, and a lot of people might be a bit tired with it in some ways. Introduce sides by all means, but try to have good and evil on both sides. You can have great conflicts without having ultimate good versus ultimate evil. Say you have a conflict that is very strong in your world is nobility versus the peasants. There are local unrests, social unrests. There is a fight between the poor and the rich, and there is good rich and bad rich, and there is good poor and bad poor. So you have good and evil on both sides. It's still the peasants, the good ones and the bad ones are working together, and the nobles, the good and the bad ones, are sort of working together as well in that conflict. Or maybe you have priests versus wizards, and you have evil wizards and good wizards, and you have evil priests and good priests, same as you have evil gods and good gods. Yet still they are fighting against each other as two sides and such. But in the end, really, the most important thing about world building is to get started. Don't overthink things. Don't make long lists of things you might want to do and how things are connected. Just get started. Grab a piece of paper, write the town name, write the main name of the mayor, maybe create a map. Get started. That's the main thing. Speaking of maps, maps are a very, very good place to start in my opinion, and we will be making a video, probably the next world building video, about maps and concentrating on that sort of thing a bit more. Now, maps can serve the purpose of drawing yourself into your own world and making yourself more interested in that world very well, and that is a very important thing, because a game master that starts to lose interest in his own world, that game master is probably not going to be very entertaining for the players either. And it will be a slog, and the group will probably break apart sooner rather than later. So try to get interested in your own world. Sounds weird, but that's how it is. I have talked to several game masters who have said, I just lost interest and I couldn't do it anymore, and the group broke apart. And also maps are the same way. They can draw in your players into the world. There is something in human nature that wants to explore the unknown. That's something that's deep inside of us. And a map, a piece of parchment that has the names of exotic places, the names of dangerous places, of mysterious places, it fuels our imagination. It makes us want to go out there and see those places for ourselves. And that is exactly what you want as a game master, as you are world building. You want a world that grips your players, draws them in, and never lets them go. Now that was our first video about world building. Let me know what you think about it, and let me know if you have any core issues that you want to have raised while doing the basic of your world building that I might not have mentioned. If you like the content, please subscribe to our channel to see more content like that. And as always, until we see each other again, good luck in your own games, and I will see you on the internet.